Hi everyone, I'm Rachel Kane. I am the program manager for the Public Art Archive. The archive is a totally free, online, and very much growing database of completed public art projects. The archive is a project of WESTAF, the Western States Arts Federation, and there's a brochure in your swag bags that tells you all about it, and I'm happy to talk more about it if anybody wants to. WESTAF is a 40-year-old nonprofit art service organization, and WESTAF supports the arts through technology systems, one of which is the Public Art Archive, and through an annual symposium and related professional development opportunities, not unlike this conference. WESTAF is proud to support Sculpture City and all of your work in the arts. It is now my pleasure to introduce our next panel organizer, Dylan Gauthier, who has brought together an impressive panel of artists, activists, and curators whose work has included or explored online artistic production. Dylan is a media artist and educator, and currently a digital policy and programming fellow at Hunter College. At Hunter, he teaches courses on art and technology, internet and society, and interaction design. In his work, he uses videos, images, soundtracks, publications, situations, environmental research, and performance to explore temporary occupations, land use, public space, and access to information. In addition, he is a co-founder of the urban waterfront collective Mare Librum and a member of the publishing and art collective Red 76. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dylan.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Let me open up my notes here. Hello, everyone. These tables at the front here are kind of empty if anybody wants to sit up front, and we could put some plants there maybe. I think, yeah, thanks again, Rachel. Thanks, Mary Lou and Meredith and Ashley, wherever you guys are right now, for organizing everything and bringing us here, and for inviting us to be here. It's really an honor to take part in this conference, and I hope that what we can add to it is sort of a new, a different perspective, and certainly a new media-focused perspective. So it'll be interesting to go from there. I think it's kind of fitting that we're up here in this void, this negative space. We've been talking a bit about negative spaces, and certainly the internet presents something that is at once solid or questionably solid, and also seems to have something to do with the void. I do have a fondness for digression, and I'm going to be using this sort of digital leash to keep me on time and on track, so I hope I'm not texting or on Facebook right now. I promise. I'm a media artist and curator and educator based in New York City. I'm going to introduce our panelists shortly, and first I just wanted to give some background on why we're here and what thoughts brought us here today, and maybe suggest a few ways that we might consider the monument or the anti-monument in this moment where we are so frequently transfixed, amused, bemused, some would say consumed, if not wholly confused, by digital culture. For the sake of the panel, we're kind of using the terms digital culture, network culture, and the internet, the internet society, almost interchangeably to imply the effects of emerging communications technologies on culture at large, including the culture and industries around our production, distribution, and reception. So the internet itself has been called alternately de facto public sphere, a public-private partnership, public space, a formerly public space, a corporatized space, an ideological playground, a post-ideological playground, a factory for the production of culture, knowledge, and value, a key to productivity, revolutionary, a time waster, retrograde, etc. It's both monumental in its scope and size and anti-monumental in how little we see of this infrastructure. Though I think more and more we're becoming aware of these as its infrastructure surfaces in our collective imaginations through debates about policies surrounding real-world issues such as data centers, demands on public utilities, concerns over public policy, including surveillance, energy consumption, invisible labor, issues like this. At the same time, for an artist and arts institutions, the internet seemingly provides this channel to create and also interface, in that kind of using that techie term, with a global public beyond the traditional art viewers or the walls of a museum or even the walls of sort of art education. It's exciting as an artist or an institution or a small municipality or a large municipality to think about participation and collaboration on this global scale. But what do we mean when we talk about site in the context of site-specific, and what does this have to do with the internet anyway? Questions of authorship and ownership among contrasting definitions of online space are paramount. How does an artist create work for online platforms, say, when the terms of service of many of these platforms restrict rights to the content we create for them? How does an institution compete with ownership rights to a work produced online when that work perhaps is owned by a service provider? And then finally, not finally, but additionally, what, if anything, can we learn from the tools and modes of network culture, including sharing, appropriation, recycling, collaboration over distances, iterative design phases, layers of augmenting of reality, open source production? Oh, I think I'm off my slide here. Can I back up to the beginning?
Yeah, you're back to the beginning.
What's that?
You're back to the beginning.
There should be 2 slides before this.
Sorry.
Okay, thank you. There we go. Check your slides. Me, not you, sorry. So digital cultural artifacts are displayed by such ideas of, are defined by such ideas of display and interface, constrained by questions of access, upgradability, and obsolescence. Art online can often seem like a complex system of meetings reduced to flat images, flat surfaces. Though these stand-ins for the art object are not without the capacity to leave traces on our memory. Distribution platforms like image blogs, video sharing sites, and social networks have broader reach than traditional cultural venues, and also reach a varied audience of cultural consumer. That said, they offer a less stable outlook and are more susceptible often to technological and market-based obsolescence than traditional venues. Following in Rosalind Deutsch's question, what political issues are at stake in the discourse on art and public space, I asked our panelists today to respond to the question, what political issues are at stake in the discourse on public art and the internet? In doing so, I hope we might propose a new language and or a few propositions to aid our thinking on network monuments and to include them in what we talk about when we talk about public art. As we will see, incorporating digital or networked online structures of artistic production into our understanding of public art will pose difficult questions in relation to the themes and topics mentioned above. Fitting of the conversation about the internet, I'd like to offer a brief diversion, and it does not involve cats, in the form of a few metaphors. It does involve cats later. A few metaphors that might help us think about monumentality or anti-monumentality in relation to this online culture. So is that cutting off over there? Is there any way to take a second here? This is just part of the talk. We'll see some of these issues with technology. This is just a PDF though, so wow. So this is a quote by the poet Bernadette Meyer, who, in addition to co-founding the experimental journal 0 to 9 in 1967, in 1971 also produced the traveling exhibit and subsequent publication Memory. This publication was comprised of, an exhibition was comprised of approximately 1,200 photographs taken in the month of July of that year, taking a roll a day along with 195 pages of prose. I'll skip ahead. This is a cover, cut off part of a cover of her book. So in what was Memory in 1971, compared with the quote that I mentioned from a reading that she gave earlier this month, the question is, what is Meyer doing right now in giving memory to the internet? Is she saying that memory, or at least its fabricated, artisanally produced proxy, is no longer necessary? Or does she suggest that memory might now be a commons, no longer beholden to a single authorial voice, but composed of variously authored content, data, and infrastructures? In other words, the collective sum of our contributions and conversations. Let's say that monuments don't last forever, at least not always in the place and form they are intended to be. Digital monuments are probably even more fleeting, pinned as they are on this cycle of planned obsolescence, rapid innovation. That said, digital monuments might be able to migrate to new containers and forms more readily than brick and mortar monuments when cultures, tastes, or even political regimes change. Then again, perhaps this is not always a desirable thing. As a modified sculpture in reality. However, imaginary monuments, such as the ideological monuments of utopias, whether they're capitalist online corporate utopias or some more fun utopias, monuments that were never supposed to be built, have an easier time of this displacement and find a perfect home on this monumental or unmonumental internet. A monument that can change shape and function depending on the dominant ideological paradigm or even the social needs of a specific population allows us to think of perhaps time-sharing our monumental projects to suit the needs of diverse stakeholders. I think here, again, I think this was brought up yesterday, but the work of Krzysztof Wojsko's in his work Homeless Projection, which famously reconfigured public monumental sculpture to reflect underrepresented populations, is an example of this, a pre-internet example of this. We might think of this as well in the terms that marketers talk about narrowcasting as opposed to broadcasting. So this idea that we could tailor things to specific whims of the viewer, and this can be accomplished through augmented reality that has options for people. Attempts to create monuments or anti-monuments to digital culture are also akin to Robert Smithson's documentation of the Hotel Palenque, the subject of the slide lecture famously delivered at the University of Utah in 1972. The artist memorialized that site somewhere between ruin and functioning hotel, a ruin in reverse in his words, in the end concluding that it could only function as a monument to the collapse of vision. In a place that is so fleeting, Smithson writes, you find nothing but memory trace, or what I might say traces of memories. As Neville Wakefield writes of Smithson's talk, Hotel Palenque expands his conception of a non-site, a, quote, discursive and ramshackle web of imagery, conjecture, analysis, and recollection, which, like the hotel itself, lacks either focus or direction. Perambulatory and meandering, the horizon lines of thought unfold as a series of impossible boundaries. Anecdotes, like hotel passages, lead nowhere. This non-site, or this web of meanings, I think is a pretty good way to frame our understanding of the experience of sight on the internet. As another example, one that we've taken for the title, we might look at the work of the enigmatic filmmaker, visual artist, early adopter of electronic media, Chris Marker, with his 1997 interactive CD-ROM, Immemory, which of course was obsolete almost before it was released to the public. Explained in the liner notes accompanying the CD-ROM, Immemory, like the anti-monument, is proposed as an alternative to hegemonic thinking around personal and collective memory. Quoting Marker here, in our moments of megalomaniacal reverie, we tend to see our memory as a kind of history book. We are the characters of an epic novel. A more modest and perhaps more fruitful approach might be to consider the fragments of memory in terms of geography. In every life, we would find continents, islands, deserts, swamps, overpopulated territories, and terrae incognitae. So here's the stuff of the internet. Again, this unknowable topography filled with these incremental associations of memory. Skipping ahead. As such, the personal history of all or some, as we see it online, these unmonumental moments of our lives might be essential to the creation of meaningful and engaging monumental forms, both online and in real life. Moving away from photography and tempted by the ability to create entirely immersive landscapes, such as the ones offered by the multi-user online world Second Life, Marker, like Meyer, abandoned simple image production for the ability to create open-ended, participatory structures and immersive landscapes. And again, this is a few slides from his work in Second Life, where he created a workspace. And I think here, thinking again about the relationships between memory and geography, to connect this again to site online and eventually to a particular website, skipping through some images from, these are all Chris Marker's Louvoir and Second Life. So there are cats involved, as I promised. Thinking about online geographies, and again, this question of, what does that mean? What is the site? What is the site when we talk about internet? We can enter in with the example of the 90s era web page builder hosting service, GeoCities, which Yahoo bought in 1999 for $3.6 billion and then shut down in 2009, 10 years later. GeoCities allowed anyone to build a small a custom web page for free, keep their pictures and ideas there, and it was organized around this idea of neighborhoods, cities, states, and so on and so forth. As the eulogy in the Los Angeles Times puts it, it was the first mainstream example of an open, participatory, and personal internet. It was also in the context of this conference, I think, an example of participatory monument making. Its subject was our collected experience of geography, both of the still murky territories of the internet and of the broader world. In the early days of the internet, it was visited by almost 3 million people annually. If GeoCities would seem to be about personal memories as a totalized entity, it is just as much about a collective memory, a document, or we might say an anti-monument to a time, that is the early 90s online. Navigation of GeoCities pages presented an online monument as both a multivocal and also an equivocal undertaking, something tied to but exceeding the role of a mere public archive. The only trace today remains as warehoused data downloadable as a single 900 gigabyte file. The images that we see here on screen are taken from a new artistic project, 1 terabyte of kilobyte age, which is initiated recently by the net artists Allahyari and Dragan Espenshid, in which the pair delve into these archived GeoCities data almost as archaeologists. It's like most forms of archaeology, the kind that does not restore the original function of the artifact, but allows us to catalog and from there interpret what may have been going on at the time. This is a very small Great Library of Alexandria, only 3 floors. And a lot of it, of course, was always under construction. Some of you may have had pages on GeoCities, as I did. So looking at a real-world example, we might think of a crowdsourced monument such as the one that Anthony Gormley, City of London, premiered in 2009, the same year that GeoCities shut down. One and the other, a project for the empty fourth plinth at Trafalgar Square, of which you're no doubt cognizant already, but to just use it in this context here to say that it ran for a period of over 100 days, welcoming over 2,400 participants. It was unveiled within a cycle of propositions for reimagining the use of the empty plinth. His work combined the traditional idea of a public monument, which is ancient, isolated, a symbol of state power, with crowdsourced participation and the appeal of the mass audience as participants in this work of art, in making the work of art. To quote Gormley, rather than reproducing static ideas about monumental art and state power, one another transformed the fourth plinth into something else, something closer to an examination of power itself. Participants used the literal platform literally as an open platform to do whatever they pleased for the allotted time, creating an ephemeral monument to the politics and attitude of 2009 in every way, as tangible and visible through its documentation and the circulation of these documentation images on the internet as any other of the Trafalgar monuments that predate it. In fact, it's the one that I think of when I think of Trafalgar Square more than knowing any of the other monuments by rote. Hopefully the examples provided by our panel will further pick up some of these themes and elucidate on them in showing us some of their work and experience working in this sort of online, offline, in real life realm. In the order that they will be presenting, we have, I'll give you an introduction in a minute just to say that they'll present for approximately 10 to 12 minutes, after which we'll follow up with a group discussion, and then we'll open up the floor to your questions, and hopefully you'll have some in your participation. So just to introduce the panel straight on, we have to my right, Morehshin Allahyari is a new media artist and art activist. She was born and raised in Iran and moved to the United States in 2007. Her creative and research interest encompasses experimental 3D animation, digital filmmaking, installation, performance, extensive activity as a cultural curator. Her animated films and curatorial projects have received worldwide acclaim. She's been part of numerous national and international exhibitions, festivals, and conferences, received the Arch and Anne Gill Kimbrough Award from Dallas Museum of Art, was an artist in residence from the media program at Banff Center, and she's currently a visiting assistant professor at the Art and Technology Department at the University of Texas in Dallas. To her right is Sara Reisman, who is the director of the New York City's Present for Art program, which commissions permanent artworks for newly constructed and renovated city-owned spaces, indoors and out. Recently commissioned artists include Pablo Helguera, Rico Gatson, Julianne Swartz, Karen Olivier, among others. As an independent curator, Sara has organized projects like Still Acts, a group exhibition at La Mama's La Galleria about the potential of stillness in performance and choreography, and solo projects by Claudia Joskowitz, Sympathy for the Devil, and Christopher K. Ho, Privileged White People at Forever and Today Incorporated. She was the 2011 Critic in Residence at Art Omai, an international visual arts residency in upstate New York, and a 2013 Marika Vilcek Fellow, which is organized by the Foundation for Civil Society. To Sarah's right is Tim Portlock. From 2001 to 2004, Tim worked for the University of Paris 4 Anglophone Studies Department as a technical and creative director for various projects using computer game technology to create simulations of historically significant spaces. He's exhibited his art in venues around the world, including the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Ars Electronica, and the Tate Modern as a member of the artist collective Vox Populi. In 2009, Tim was awarded the Pew Fellowship for Art. He's currently an associate professor in the Film Media Department at Hunter College. Angela Washko, who is there on the end, is an artist and facilitator devoted to mobilizing communities and creating new forms for discussions of feminism where they do not exist. Her practice is research-based, employing data and creating archives as storytelling tools to create also prototypes for actions by others. Interested in broadening public opinion around what women should do and be, her works infiltrate a number of publics through interventions in video game spaces, performances in physical public space, network-based projects, radio archives, and curatorial endeavors. She's a recent recipient of the Franklin Furnace Fund Archive, a Danish International Visiting Artist Grant, the Terminal Award for International-Based Art Commissions, and the head curator of the last Conflux Festival. So I'll ask you to please join me in applauding Morehshin and Allahyari, and thank you very much for your time.
Hi, thanks for being here. I guess, okay. So I'm just gonna let you know next, right? Okay, so I want to actually start with this image, which some of you might know what it is, but these bronze boots are the only remains of a statue of Reza Shah Pahlavi, which was, the last king of Iran, after protesters pulled it down during the 1979 Islamic Revolution. If you want to go next. So growing up in Iran, for years and years, I watched a video of similar statues being torn or pulled down during and after the revolution. And another example, which actually happened recently, can you go next, is the disappearance of these statues in Tehran, which happened in actually 2010, in April and May 2010, which actually refers to robberies committed during these 2 months. These are like just some examples, but 12 bronze statues of national heroes disappeared from public places for unknown reasons. Most of these statues are from people who are, in one way or another, known as national and basically not religious, and very influential figures in the Iranian history. Some of these statues also are more abstract, but perhaps are against certain religious or moral values. The Iranian government did not accept any responsibility for these stolen pieces and claimed that it will start investigating the issue, which they actually never did. It's been 4 years now. So I think for me, these two events bring important points that I think is kind of relevant to these projects that I'm going to talk about. One is that how do some monuments become so socially powerful that people seek to destroy them? The second question, or I guess thought or idea, is that sometimes an object becomes a monument only when it's destroyed or altered. So for example, as I was saying, Shah's boots now stand as a sign of destroyed full sculpture that it replaced. They're the symbols of a pre-revolution life in Iran that, like many other events and stories, have been altered and manipulated to carry a new message. In fact, these boots are supposed to stand as a symbol of dictatorship of Shah regime that the government hopes to promote and keep alive as one of the most highlighted topics of pre-revolution life in Iran. So the decision to keep these boats is an interesting decision, and to remove the rest of the body. And I think it remains a great example of the idea that the making, altering, and destroying art can itself become a new mode of memory. So can you go next? I'm going to now talk about this body of work. Actually, I have this slide. So this is a example of just like 2 images of the pedestal without the sculpture. So if you look online now of these sculptures that now of the location of these sculptures, they're still, the pedestal is there, but you don't see the sculpture anymore. Next. So now I want to talk about, all these issues or topics that I talked about, which are kind of both personal and historical, as examples and for entrance to a body of work that I've started 9 months ago called Dark Matter, which kind of, makes me think about how I can make sculptures out of objects that they themselves are forbidden as a remembrance of life that I lived in Iran, or the life of my relatives or friends who currently live in Iran. Can you go next? So I've decided to create basically my own monuments that exist both in analog and digital forms. One of the definitions of monuments is that they can be described as a type of structure that has become important to a social group as part of their remembrance of historical or certain period of time, and also cultural heritage. So I'm taking a more of a poetic approach to monuments and kind of like this definition. But thinking about this project, which is called Dark Matter, which is a series of combined sculptural objects created and reappropriated in a software called Maya, some of you might know about it, and 3D printed to form humorous juxtapositions. So can you go next, please? So I want to give you like a little bit of background because some of you might not know about the forbidden aspect of like some of these objects. So the first, there's an image of a Barbie and a Simpson, which was banned and forbidden in Iran. Like growing up, I remember, I owned Barbies and Simpsons, but like my mother would like bring them from like different countries because she was a flight attendant. So the only way for me to have access to these toys was like through another channel like this. Next, please. Or like, for example, dogs, which are actually not objects, but you can get a ticket for like walking your dog, in the street. And I had a dog for like 6-7 years, but I would usually try to keep it in our yard or like in our house. Next, please. And then satellite dishes, which again, some of you might know about this, the government goes back and forth between bringing them down, although like so many people in Iran own, satellite dishes to be able to have access to Western channels. Next, please. Okay, so this is the first project. It's a dog wearing a dildo with a satellite dish on top of it. So basically, this is the first process where I create these sculptures in Maya or reappropriate them. Can you go next, please? And then I 3D print them. So the process of 3D printing itself, I guess, is a really interesting part of the project for me, which I'll talk about in a second. Next, please. So yeah, this is like, again, the first series, and then if you go next, this is another one, which is a Barbie with a VHS or video, as her body. If you go next, please, another image of it, and next. This is like another one, which is pig, like ham being forbidden, or I guess in Islam, you're not supposed to, if you're Muslim, you're not supposed to eat it, and then obviously guns. If you go next, this is a 3D printed version of it. And then the next one is the one that is, I just got done with the modeling of it, which is a Buddha with Simpson, but also like recently, in the last like 2-3 years, the government has become very sensitive about, Buddha's statues, and they don't want people to have them, so they've been going to stores and asking them if they could like, bring it down and not sell it, etc. So next. So this is another aspect of the project. So what's called, the flip-flop, which is, this process of pushing a work of art or craft from the physical world to the digital world, and then also back again, maybe more than once. So this is another component of my project where I, after I 3D print them, I kind of like didn't think about creating these like virtual landscapes or environments for each series of the work. This is the first one. The work is still in progress. So this is the first one. If you go next, you can see like a little bit, if you play it, you have to probably hit space, yeah. So it's like, it's one thing that I'm really interested in, and I think this is where the idea of monuments and the relationship with space and time is very interesting to me as an artist, that monuments are usually fixed in a space, and also like they belong to a specific time or, period of history. But I wanted to create this timeless, spaceless landscape as a way of entering the historical dimension of the work. To think about, the historical aspect of a sculpture made out of forbidden, unwelcome objects and elements, and what does it mean to look at these pieces, and also like the 3D printed version of these pieces in 20-30 years. So next, please. Which brings in, the next part about the 3D printers. Now, the potential of like using a 3D printer to create these objects. Like thinking about 3D printing, the process itself, or the 3D printing of the forbidden as political resistance, and kind of like the idea of private and collective memories. So again, this becoming a symbol of a life, or like, this post-revolution life in Iran. Next, please. And also thinking about 3D printing as this technology that will allow you for collecting, archiving, documenting, or in a more like poetic way, I guess, to resist forgetting. But one thing that I find really interesting is that I am gathering all these pieces, all these objects that are forbidden or unwelcome, and then I'm creating kind of like this archive, right? This like historical archive of like these pieces that, again, in 20 or 30 years, when you look back at them, they might not be forbidden or unwelcome anymore. Next, please. So to just close all this down, one thing that I found really interesting is that in contemporary age, cultural monument is defined as a document which makes the monument, the medium, and the message at the same time. Or at least, in the works that I show you, that's how I like to think about them. Modern memory is above all archival, and according to Pinora, it relies entirely on the materiality of the trace, the immediacy of the recording, and the visibility of the image. Next, please. And so, finally, I want to leave you with this idea, or perhaps the question and the potential, the question of, first of all, the difference of the relationship that each monument has with different audience, the past, the memory, and the knowledge condition. And the fact that I'm bringing together these both virtual and also like analog physical, sculptures and monuments together. But also, I guess one thing that I'm really interested in, I think this would be a way maybe to think about how else we can think about monuments, or where else the potential, I guess, of monuments is, the question and I guess the potential and the radical notion of 3D printers themselves. The fact that now you can think about 3D printing something that is forbidden, and in some ways it can be, functional. Obviously not the dog one, but I don't know, the dildo one maybe. But the fact that you can still, or like even the Buddha statue, right? So this idea of now having access to files, digital files that you can send to other people, and the fact that, they can probably 3D print them if they have access to that technology. So yeah, that was it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I really like this panel, and I really like this conference. So I'm going to talk about this first image is a law, a piece of legislation, which you could sort of consider it just a piece of paper or a PDF, something very ephemeral. But it's Local Law 65, the Percent for Art law, which requires that new construction on city property in New York City incorporate permanent art into its design. It's a brief law, but it has had major impact since 1982 when it was passed. Since 1982, 320 commissions by individual artists have been completed, and 85 commissions are underway now in places like public schools, streetscapes, plazas, parks, courthouses, water pollution control plants, places where I'm proud to commission artwork where the art public doesn't necessarily go. I think that's really interesting. So as we've been talking about memorials, what has kind of become clear to me is that there's always a mission with a memorial. But what's interesting with Percent for Art is there's not really a general mission of what the artwork should be or what an artist should make when he or she's commissioned. The artist might make a proposal, but it might change over time, over the 2 or 3 or 5 years that it'll take to complete the artwork. But what I'm finding interesting is that this law itself expresses a kind of ideology. It's like a monument to creativity, artistic production in New York City that is written into law. So I think what it really conveys to me, having worked with this program over the last 6 years, is that artistic production is important to New York City. But once in a while, we are asked to take on a commission that incorporates a memorial theme. So I'm going to move to the next. Does this work? Okay, oops. Which way should I be pointing it?
I can just do it for you.
Okay, so the next few slides show a couple of examples of memorials that have developed under my watch. And the first one is by Mary Miss. Some of these artworks were intended to be memorials, and then a few later on will become memorials. And I think you'll see why. It's interesting. So Mary Miss was commissioned to do an artwork for a courthouse in Staten Island that it turned out when the city and state did an environmental study in 2000 there were human remains on this site. So what had happened at this site, after some archaeological research, it became clear that this had been the site of the Marine Quarantine Hospital from 1799 to 1850 something, I think 1856. Can you advance a few slides? Keep going. So here's a view of the site, and what Mary Miss did, keep going. More? Okay, so she made a memorial to immigration. What might not be obvious is this quarantine hospital was a site where immigrants were being diverted from Manhattan to be sort of, first of all, because there was so much immigration, there wasn't enough kind of administrative support to bring them into Manhattan. But so they were diverted to Staten Island, set up on boats where they were being quarantined, and then a hospital was built. So what emerged in Mary's research was the history of immigration and how it led to the sort of beginnings of health policy. So the piece is made of these steel encasements with red glass inside that are etched. If you can advance a few more slides. They're etched with text about this history of both immigration and the history of health policy. The next, if you can move ahead to the peace sign. This next artwork is a commission that we were asked to organize on behalf of the Norwegian government, which was kind of an awkward proposition because it involved private money, and for New York City, receiving private money for whatever reason is really complicated. So we did an open call and focused it towards the Norwegian artist community, and the artist who got the commission is Lena Vista Gronli. But the context is that there's a plaza near the United Nations, across from the United Nations on 1st Avenue and 42nd Street called Trygve Lie Plaza. So in 1997, it was dedicated to Trygve Lie, who was one of the founders of the United Nations, helped acquire the land for the United Nations. So two of his grandsons approached us and the city saying, we want to create a bust to our grandfather. And it would be a replica of one that's outside of Oslo. Well, the city doesn't really receive replicas. I'm not really sure why. Maybe it's just because we have too much stuff, and that we can get into that a bit later in terms of conservation and maintenance. But so Lena proposed this artwork. Originally, she actually proposed a big paperclip because that was a sign of participating in the resistance during World War II in Norway. But a paperclip seemed a little bit too whimsical. So she proposed this artwork. If you can advance a few more slides. It's called the peace clock, which is a symbol of nuclear disarmament, and it was something that Trygve Lie advocated for. So the clock is a clock that has only one hand that moves. You can advance a few more slides. Here, stop here. So here you see the peace sign. It's 4:30, and then at any other time of day, it won't be the peace sign. Can you go ahead? So here it's a kind of abstraction that at some point we'll get back to peace, but not yet. And it's across from the United Nations. We actually moved it closer to the corner in order to make it register in kind of correlation with the UN, but also with pedestrian traffic in the area. So keep going till you get to the next artwork, please. This is an artwork by Chakaya Booker, which certainly didn't begin as a memorial at all. In New York City, in Brooklyn, there's a site called Weeksville Heritage Center, which was one of the first free black communities in the United States. And there are several historic houses at that site. Can you advance? So what you see here is a rendering of a site that was just finished called Weeksville Heritage Center. It's like a combination library, art center, cultural center. And so there are exhibitions inside, and Chakaya was commissioned to produce this work called Sugar in My Bowl. And I think a colleague here probably commissioned that, Charlotte Cohen. So Sugar in My Bowl is a piece that's considered a portal. And the first time when I met with her, it was underway. It was about 50% complete. We went to her studio in, I want to say Pennsylvania, but it was outside of New York City. She was asked by an engineer, so what's it about? And she said, sex. But I think then I went back to her artist statement. She said sex and kind of laughed. And then I went back to her artist statement a few years later because it took that long, not for her to make the work, but for the site to be complete and ready to receive the artwork. And the statement talks about this tension between community development and personal interests or personal needs. So Sugar in My Bowl is a kind of commemoration of what you need for yourself in relation to the larger community context. Can you keep going? So this next piece is something that takes place in a public school, also not meant as a memorial, but I think it kind of looks like one. Can I get some water? It's an artwork by Tat Fu Tan, who some of you may know. He's a social practice artist who's engaged with sustainability and ecology and culinary arts. And this artwork is the SOS Pledge, which stands for Sustainable Organic Steward. And you can probably read it, so I don't know that I need to read it to you, but it's a play on the Pledge of Allegiance, and the idea is that as students come in and out of the school every day, PS 971 in Brooklyn, they'll have to think a little bit about their role in the environment. The reason I think this is somewhat of a memorial in the future is that it's going to look really strange in 10 or 15 years when there are different environmental concerns that we're dealing with that are maybe more urgent than whether we eat fresh produce or take public transportation. Keep going, please. This next artwork is not at all a memorial, and it actually segues into a different kind of category. It is dedicated to Shakespeare. It's an artwork by Ben Rubin, new media artist who runs a studio called Ear Studio. And the artwork is in the Public Theater in New York, which was founded as the New York Shakespeare Workshop. And so Ben's artwork pays homage to Shakespeare, but in a kind of radical way. It's a chandelier with 37 LED displays. And each display corresponds to one of Shakespeare's 37 plays. So if you click through a few more, you'll see that there are these correspondences in text between the different plays. And it's a piece that I find is really exciting. It does somewhat reflect our experience of the web in real life. But you have this experience of Shakespeare. It's in a place that kind of always goes back to Shakespeare, even when they go forward to other kinds of theater, newer theater. And what I love about it the most is that every time you go back, there's a different display, a different read, a different poem that is a collection of Shakespearean texts. Keep going. This is a piece that definitely reflects on our experience of the internet. It's by Penelope Umbrico, who made this artwork for Intermediary School 71 in Staten Island. If you advance one more. It's an artwork called Cabinet, like a cabinet of curiosities. But a lot of her artwork as a photographer involves mining images from the internet and printing them as photographs in a collection. So this is a collection of flora and fauna that might be referenced in the school context. And as a student walks by it over the next 5 years or next 7 years, he or she's going to see different things depending on what height that student is. Keep going. Keep going. Again. This piece is by Peter Rostovsky at Spring Creek High School, and it's an artwork that reflects on the web in a sense because it's called Sunrise Curtain. He's a painter, so if we go forward a few slides with a few seconds in between, you'll see in the auditorium there's an artwork called Sunrise Band, and that artwork is hand-painted by Peter, of course. And then this, can you go ahead one more? Yeah. So there's this interplay between the hand and technology as a tool. So I think this piece may not be obvious to the students in a way. Its subject matter is what would come across more, the kind of hope and aspirations of the sunrise of the beginning. And Peter and I have discussed the idea that, well, it could also be a sunset, right? And he says, yeah, but we'll leave that open. So we can advance a few more. This artwork is by Ellen Harvey, and this kind of falls under the category of what kind of participation can happen with public art, permanent public art, which is so hard to kind of engage. Who do you engage? How many people do you engage? How do you select the participants? Is it crowdsourced? In this case, the artwork is called Mathematical Star. It's for Marcy Plaza in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. And the artwork incorporates references to different locations around the neighborhood that community members identified. And then Ellen kind of documented them and cropped them into a diamond and created this pattern. So if you can advance a few more. If you go back to the map, those are the locations referenced. Then go forward. So there are these sites in the neighborhood that become part of the pattern. And this is just one example of the way that participation could happen. It involved a lot of meetings with the community board, which is interesting, sometimes troubling. Why can't it be representational? And Ellen's mission was it should be a secret history of Bed-Stuy. So those who know it, when they walk up, and this has happened when we've been there, oh, there's the window of the Baptist Church. That's the ceiling from Weeksville Heritage Center, which isn't very far away. So keep going. And then this is another piece that's a kind of a different form of participation by Natasha Johnson Messenger called Alter View. And the artwork is in the balcony of a school in Long Island City. And if you advance forward, it's the circle. It's an integrated design piece that frames the New York City skyline from Queens. And it's the kind of perfect location for a selfie, right? And I assume all students have phones, if not smartphones. I don't know about that. Keep going. Keep going. And then I just want to talk briefly, really briefly. So Percent for Art is part of the city government, and there's a lot of kind of anxiety, or there had been over the last 5 years that I was involved, that if we highlight what we do too prominently or too openly to the public, we will be scrutinized for picking the wrong artist, and that always happens anyway. So, but so what I'm showing you is a couple slides. We can go through them. The next one, this is an artwork by Jean Shin, Michael Rakowitz. This is what our website has looked like probably since, like, I don't know when, 2003. And I was very interested in trying to create a more interactive way that people could comment on artwork, or at least we could write about artwork that's underway as opposed to in the past, because that's been the policy for a long time, is we don't document it and put it out in the world till it's done. So if you go to the next slide, this is just a screenshot from our Tumblr blog, which is a site where different people at the agency write about projects underway. So on this slide, you have an image of an artwork in progress by Brian Toll, which is for Flatbush Avenue Streetscape, referencing some Daniel Chester's French sculptures that used to be part of the bridge, the Manhattan Bridge. And Allison Sarr's artwork, which is a memorial to Harriet Tubman. In that moment, you see an interview with a fellow that worked with us. Keep going. Keep going. So it's sort of like we're shifting into real time, or into web time, from real time to the virtual. And I think the question that I would ask within this situation is that it's painfully clear to me, maybe it should be less painful, but that there's this experience in real time that people using these sites have in relation to the artwork versus people who are interested in art and who would chase this down online. And I'm curious, wondering what would it look like if that experience was shared, if there was like a stronger connection between the two places. So that's the end. Thank you so much.
I have to figure out the system here in a second. So would I just click the clicker and
Click to the right, I think, yeah. I think you have to point it at those guys. Is it responding to you? Or
nothing?
Is there an on button?
Okay, I'm going to talk about two different ongoing, well, I'm going to talk about two different projects. One of them is a ongoing project that I've been working on for about 5 or 6 years, and I'm still working on it. And the other project is something that I worked on in 2008. So I've been making work about Philadelphia for the last 5 or 6 years. And part of that was a response to kind of the things that I experienced there as a newcomer. The other thing that I was thinking about when I started making this work was the history of American landscape in the United States, particularly 19th century American landscape painters. One of the big things that interests me about this group is this was the first generation of American artists that really conceived of itself self-consciously as Americans. And as the first generation of American artists, they were very conscious of creating a visual vocabulary to communicate a specific notion of American identity, not only to the American population, but to the broader world. So this was a time period in which every sort of European country had its own particular landscape tradition, which communicated some kind of unique national identity. So for us, I mean, with this particular group, there's individual differences between individual artists, but I would say if we were to generalize, the American landscape is a dangerous place. It's a beautiful place. It's a place where the industrious can thrive and survive. It's also a landscape that's blessed by God. So all of these things are kind of encoded into the vocabulary of the paintings from this period, but for a lot of people, these things are presented as if they were a natural part of the landscape, like this is something that's just there. So even though these images, many of these images were made of real world spaces, they took a lot of creative liberties to encode these kinds of notions into the landscape. So I just like randomly grabbed an image from the Hudson River Valley School to sort of show just some of the, kind of characteristic conventions. And like one of the obvious ones is this really bright sunlight, which a lot of people would interpret as the presence of God on the landscape. So when I moved to Philadelphia, one of the things that I learned was that it's the 7th largest city in the United States, and it also contains, according to the last figure I heard, 40,000 abandoned buildings and lots. And sort of encountering this volume of buildings was kind of overwhelming. But I knew over time I would become used to this. And talking to my neighbors, there was like a weird dichotomy. Like on the one hand, they were consciously aware these things exist, but on the other hand, they kind of faded into the background. So my initial idea was to sort of track my awareness of this kind of strange phenomenon in this city. One of the things about 40,000 abandoned, empty buildings and lots is that these are relics of a past way of life that doesn't exist in the city anymore. And I think just the scale of this experience functions as a monument. So I make these images of Philadelphia and these abandoned spaces using the conventions of the 19th century American landscape painters. These aren't photographs. These are actually constructed using software that I think has been mentioned already called Maya. And Maya is primarily made for the filmmaking industry. So you watch these like science fiction films with, spaceships and whatnot. All of that stuff is created using visual effects software, like what I use. So one of the things that using the software enables me to do is to take the same kind of creative license that the 19th century artists took by using paint. So what I've been primarily focusing on is recreating with these digital tools the specific abandoned buildings that I've been documenting in Philadelphia, and then constructing cities that are made up entirely of these buildings. So this is me selecting details from the landscape and making whole new images of a whole new city from that. That's a reflection of Philadelphia, or an aspect of Philadelphia. And then 2 years ago, Las Vegas was the home foreclosure capital of the United States, so I made a series of images about that. This is Philadelphia again. I mean, all the buildings in these images are based on an actual building in the city. And here's a screenshot just showing you the difference between the image and then kind of like a production image, like a wireframe, showing, kind of giving you an idea of like how I constructed this. Okay, so the second project, which I did in 2008, is called Ghost of the Walls. And in that year, I was invited to participate in a festival of public art of young African-American artists, or I should say post-civil rights generation African-American artists, and their response to the vocabulary of the civil rights era. And that was a really great coincidence on many different levels, because I was thinking about the murals that used to be not uncommon in my hometown of Chicago. There was black arts organizations that cropped up around the black arts movement in the 60s and 70s, and sort of the local grouping of that in Chicago generated a lot of really interesting murals that no longer exist, or it's really actually hard to find one that's still up to this day. So one of the things I decided to do was to actually try and recreate a mural from that period. And so not only were these murals pretty much gone, but also they were poorly documented. So what little documentation exists of these murals, it's like really low quality, damaged, lost catalogs, etc. I was lucky in that I was able to find written descriptions of some of these murals. So like as a child, like I'm aware of them based on kind of like a visceral response, but I don't really know what the specifics of the subject matter that existed in a lot of these images. I just remember like scary image, happy image, image with lots of guys in them, et cetera, et cetera. So to actually read an account of like the specific subject matter that existed gave me a little bit of a few clues as to like how I might approach recreating one of these. So eventually what I came up with was, rather than try and locate this like amazing image that would unlock sort of a visual approach to this, was to go to what the initial intention was and what inspired a lot of these murals, which was a celebration of specific African American heroes as a way of sort of asserting an identity and marking a sort of region of the city. And so I actually used YouTube to watch a lot of the like TV shows and musical performances of the people that are actually incorporated into a lot of these murals, and made a projection called Ghost to the Walls that contain those clips. So there's two videos. One of the while they're setting that up, like one of the interesting things about a lot of the murals that were produced from the sort of Chicago version of the Chicago iteration of the Black Arts movement was the whole notion of authorship. So oftentimes, like this is called the Wall of Respect. So can you like advance it to like the middle of the clip? Okay, so I'm taking video clips on YouTube that are archives or relics of past TV shows, speeches, performances, etc., and using those to, I'm still trying to find like the best word, reconstitute, reanimate, represent some of the ideas that were current at the time. But one of the things that I was thinking about when I was making this is the vocabulary of the 1960s, early 70s, and while the visual evidence of this has disappeared, we still have a sort of rhetorical approach that still lingers with us. So if we think about the civil rights generation and how the approach to politics was, and we contrast that to post, there definitely was a change in 2008 with when Barack Obama ran for president. So one of the things that was playing around the background for me when I was thinking about this is when Barack Obama ran for Congress against a former Black Panther and lost. Just the contrast between their rhetoric and how they talked about policy was very enlightening. So this piece is not only sort of a memorialization of murals from the past that no longer exist, but kind of a marker and a changeover from civil rights generation to post-civil rights generation. This was initially shown in a public housing project in Minneapolis, and just by coincidence, it was projected while the first presidential debates happened between John McCain and Barack Obama. And in the next clip, I have documentation of that. And if you could skip that to the middle of the clip, I'd really appreciate it.
And region, and the result, military strikes into Pakistan.
Can you take it to the middle?
You don't do that. You don't say that out loud. If you have to do things, you have to do things. And you work with the Pakistani government. Now, the new president of Pakistan, Qadari, has got his hands full. And this area on the border is not been governed since the days of Alexander the
you can
Great.
pause it.
I've been to this area.
All right, you get an idea. I mean, it was a coincidence, and this audio isn't, the audio is actually from the environment because, you know, the people were so ramped up by the election that when the actual first debate happened, people were playing the debate on the radios and everyone had opened up their windows. So that's the actual debate coming out of a car stereo next to the projector. So I showed this projection infrequently, unfortunately. I don't get a lot of opportunities to show it, but it does have a permanent place on YouTube, which is where I got all the clips that I used to make it. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to attempt to master the clicker also, and this iPad. One moment, please. There we go. Hi. Our collective hearty laugh about Twitter earlier does not bode well for me, but I'm going to try to be as accessible as possible while talking almost exclusively about digital game spaces. I can't really start talking about monuments in the digital without talking about space. There's a reason why the language of the internet and other digital multi-user software is spatial in nature. We use terms like domains, portals, gateways, networks, even older terms like the information highway. These are all very spatial. What are the characteristics of projected spaces that can be accessed by people from extremely disparate geographic locations all at the same time? So what are we looking at here? If I could get just a polling from hand raising, who can recognize what this space is? That is better than I expected and still pretty bad. This is World of Warcraft, for those of you who didn't know. It's okay. Most of the times I present this work in any context, not many people have played the game, even at game conferences. Which is surprising because over 10 million people play this game at any single instance. So what am I going to do? I'm going to talk a little bit about the spatial experience of the game, its relationship to public space, and yeah, I'm going to talk also, I would normally talk a little bit about how to look at the screen when you look at these games and why there are meaningful things made in this game, but I don't have enough time to do that. And it's old news anyway, but I'll just jump straight into what I do with it. In 2012, I founded the Council on Gender Sensitivity and Behavioral Awareness inside World of Warcraft. And now I'm going to do the thing where I try to advance the slide, and was successful. That's great. So I started this council. Well, I guess one of the sort of obvious things that helped me to sort of jump between this digital space and me being here physically. Obviously, we change our behavior and language when we move from place to place. When I'm at the customs office trying to get to another country and they look at me and are sort of, concerned that I'm going to cause trouble, I change my behavior there than when I'm, hanging out in our or whatever. So every digital space like this, every game space, every interface that we interact with in Facebook or Twitter or whatever, we adapt, we change, we orient to the space, to the rules of the space. In World of Warcraft, unfortunately, what's developed over the many years that it's been in existence, and since I've started playing in 2005, is that the shared sort of language code, as you may have already read, is fairly misogynistic and homophobic, and also racist, among other things. So instead of continuing to kill things to get better items, to be able to kill cooler looking things to get cooler looking items, which is what sort of the quest culture of the game forces you to do, I started having discussions with the player base about how the language ended up this way and what we could do about it, why would we want to keep it this way, why would the other women that play the game want to keep it this way, and also why feminism, as I learned throughout the process, why feminism has such an extreme connotation in so many different places. So today, in response to Monument, Anti-Monument prompt, and my experience doing performative research in this space, I wanted to talk about online game spaces in relationship to physical space. So even though these spaces are obviously digital, we experience them sort of being sucked into the computer, one's experience exploring, especially ones like these that actually represent physical space, are extremely spatial, and not just in the sort of navigating of the landscape, though here, obviously, I'm jumping off of a dragon, obviously, and I'm parachuting into some trees, which is very representative of a physical spatial experience, and not just in the way that they somehow resemble familiar faces, although they're much sexier, and not just in the way that they sort of resemble imagined navigable spaces, but also in the dimensions and formats in which players engage with each other. The design of the communication channels also has a spatial dimension that's similar to physical space. I mean, Facebook also has a physical dimension. You click on somebody and you go to their space. You inhabit their room. You meet their sort of friends and all this sort of thing. But in this space, it's even more obvious, this sort of dimension. So in this image, there's a text bubble on top of Nizen, the player, which means this player is using the say command. All players in eyesight of this character will see what he's saying. And then, so on the left of the image, there's a bunch of pink text on the bottom of the interface. And here, another player is using the whisper command to address me. And in this way, it's like a whisper. I'm the only person who can hear that sort of communication. So there's different dimensions and access to the way that the conversation is narrowed. Next. So yeah, in this way, this space is not unlike shared public space, or perhaps corporatized space, as Dylan said earlier, is maybe a little bit better of a descriptor in the way that people are paying $15 a month, $13 to $15 a month based on the pay scale that they do and the frequency that they pay, but that's not very interesting for my purposes right now. But for access to the space. So they do have to pay to participate. And everyone goes about their business in a way that they would in physical space. Here, which is the capital city of the Horde faction, called Orgrimmar, if you're interested, players buy necessary items, they meet up with other players to discuss their plans, they access travel hubs. And by my sort of injecting a conversation about feminism or the language usage, I have to be as considerate of other players' time as I would. I don't want to run in there like I would in public space with a megaphone yelling, "Somebody talk to me about feminism." Like it seems crazy in physical public space, it's also crazy there, believe it or not. So This is the part where you play the video. Oh, no. Oh, yes, it's working. That's fantastic. So this is just sort of to give you a sense of the space and what I do in it. That bird is also a real person. Okay, we can go back to the presentation. Thank you. Oh, maybe I went too far. Did I go too? No. Oh, all right. So maybe you recognize in that short clip that we're not talking about dragons and flying and all of this sort of stuff. The sort of politics of outside space are still being represented in this space. So it's not purely a space for fantasy. But what I want to get into next, I guess, is what are some of the big differences between physical space and the representative space inside this game, aside from the sort of basic computer, machine, rendered versus body, natural, tangible dichotomy. What are some of the things that make monuments impossible possible, or maybe just different in these kinds of spaces? I think that for me, one of the biggest differences in WoW and other games like it is that basically everything in the game is ephemeral. Even though they're real people operating the various moving actors, there's basically no lasting impact that human players can have on the landscape, particularly in WoW and the first-person shooter I'll show later. And this is true in many multiplayer environments. Not all, of course, and mentioned earlier, Second Life. There's a reason why Second Life is of such interest to artists. It's because you can actually contribute and change and manipulate Second Life. But I wouldn't even consider it a game, but we can talk about that later if you're down. But in WoW, this is so. You can't impact the landscape, really. Zones do this thing called repopping or repopulating. It means that once you impact the landscape or other aspects of the space will reset itself in a certain amount of time. So whatever you did will basically be undone in a varying amount of time. I can kill this poor raptor over and over again, and he will always reappear. Which is poetic and nice, but, you know, something else. These spaces are not policed the same way that physical public space is now, though it did just come out that the NSA have agents playing World of Warcraft, which is fascinating to me. But because of the lack of surveillance, multiplayer online game spaces become zones in which the suppressed, politically incorrect ideologies, sexism, racism, and homophobia in particular in the space, which are falling out of fashion in physical public space and even impact the ability to keep one's job in most spheres outside the screen, actually flourish in these spaces that aren't watched over and become the predominant language. Perhaps this is what makes them really ephemeral, in contrast to a physical world in which every inch seems to be sort of constantly recorded by cameras. These are slides of some of the unpopular, politically incorrect views I was talking about. Get back into the kitchen is what I get told repeatedly, you know, and so on. But I think there are opportunities to create monuments in these spaces, outside of the artistic impulse to represent these spaces physically and monumentalize them that way in the sort of physical world, and sort of somehow justify them by talking about them in conferences like these. I wanted to talk about another artist project, which I learned about after my own sort of endeavors in game spaces. It's a project by Joseph Delap that was done inside the multiplayer shooting game America's Army. The project is called Dead in Iraq. I think this project functions as a monument inside the space, even though it's never something that could be static there. So what's going on here? America's Army is a first-person shooter game, if you've never heard of it, which was massively popular and also notoriously has been used in American military training. Joseph DeLapp went into the space, and instead of killing other players, he started to list all the names of individuals killed in Iraq, as well as their age, the date they were killed in their military unit. This is obviously related to the creation of memorials and physical spaces. I'm sure the Vietnam memorial that's been mentioned comes to mind. But this is, I think, a monumental act within this space if we consider it in relationship to what players can contribute to these spaces. And even though the text, Eric J. Hodges, 21, Marine, November 10, 2004, will disappear in a few seconds after it's been posted, and will be quickly replaced with other texts, probably insulting him, DeLapp brings the experience of acknowledged individual deaths in war to a space in which war is simulated, desirable, prolonged, and encouraged. DeLapp's monument is also an anti-monument. It takes these deaths to a space in which war is promoted, glorified, and the potential for heroism outweighs the consequences. These people will always repop after they die. Like in World of Warcraft, which is what I said. Okay, sorry. So if you die in World of Warcraft, outside of the screen, does your avatar die too? Does your account run out and then your character eventually fades? How do you deal with outside of the screen death within the communities that you form in this game? Is there a memory of your existence in that space that relates to monuments built for dead, historically decided heroes? Or because of the ephemeral nature of WoW is the only impact that we can have on this space and the impact that we have on communities we make and the players within them. This one-sided relationship we have to the representation of space in this game, WoW specifically I'm talking about now, is a lot like corporatized urban space, the inability to contribute without institutional support aside from DIY temporary monuments, which will ultimately be removed as they aren't accepted. I would have said that this was a good analogy for the relationship between players and the environment of WoW until I found this, which is not advancing. Okay. Sometimes I do psychogeographical drifts inside World of Warcraft. And this is my last slide, so I'm getting to the end here. So with an old friend of mine that I know exclusively from the space, and I do consider him a friend even though I've never met him in person, but I've known him for 7 years, he introduced me to this monument in WoW. There are many game quest-based monuments designed by Blizzard, and you could probably argue that the piece of software itself is a sort of representation of a monument of sorts. But there are very few things built into the game aside from the chat aspect of it where you can actually talk to other people that break this kind of fourth wall and relate to real life outside the screen. This is a monument to a 19-year-old WoW player who died unexpectedly of heart failure. He was an aspiring programmer for Blizzard, the company that makes WoW. The impact that this player had on the space was able to become a permanent part of the game in a spatial, sort of monumental way. And it has no other purpose. No quest takes you to it. You don't gain anything by finding it, though I would argue that you gain some kind of magical experience. But anyway, and it's on every single server anyone can play, not just the server that he played on. So we're not fake people in these spaces. I think Web 1.0, I think a lot of us are still stuck in the idea that Web 1.0 gave us, that we're all sort of avatars hiding behind performances, doing malicious things to each other. We're not that anymore. We're so much more than that. And even, I mean, we're now accountable so much. YouTube now, you can't start an account name that's Wild Pumpkin 1978 or something. You have to be yourself. You have to be accountable for what you do in these spaces. What was I'm gonna close this out. Yeah, these real bonds that we form in these spaces are meaningful, and the communities that exist there are legitimate, and they manifest differently from those outside of these interfaces, but they're an extension. Originally, my thinking about this was that this monument was a DIY monument, but the more that I think about it, it's actually representative of the politics of physical space as opposed to the, whoa, what? Oh yeah, I know, this is the last sentence, Dylan, thanks. Sorry. What I wanted to say was that institutions still end up being the gateways to the production of lasting monuments, even in game spaces, as they are in physical spaces as well. The protocols and structures of these game spaces are more representative of the politics of physical space, as opposed to the participatory fantasy we imagined for the digital, especially in terms of access to manipulating and contributing to these aesthetics and functionality of these shared spaces. So, that's it.
All right. We have 5 minutes total. Yikes. Okay. Well, I think that we should probably forego more discussion amongst ourselves and open it up for some crowdsourced questions from the audience. And thank you. Thank you, everybody. We had one hand come up. Is there a mic out there for Q&A? No.
Nope.
So you have to speak up or. If we could just take one question, because I know we only have a few minutes and I want to make sure that other people get to ask as well, but that's a great question. Can I just have Morehshin respond to it? Is that all right? Thank you very much. Go ahead.
I guess, yeah, I guess I need you to maybe like explain a little bit what do you mean by having it. You don't have to come here, I can hear you. But what do you mean exactly by like the impact? Nothing that I know of, but I think that's, and you know, I feel like one of the problems definitely with. Oh, repeat the question. I guess I don't remember that. Okay, so the question I guess was that you were asking about specific film, right? And what was the name of the film? Because I haven't seen it. Monuments Man. Okay.
Maybe
yeah, I haven't.
Maybe you can't answer that question.
Yeah, I haven't seen it, so I can't really comment on that. And then, like, if there are other films that will have an impact, like that are about certain cultural Holocaust or like events. And you know, in case of like Iran, I think, I think it's really important to actually create. You know, like the examples that I was giving you are like there's so many other events and issues like that, right, with public sculpture or the destroying certain monuments, etc. So I think in case of Iran, I don't know really any film or documentary specifically about that. But as an artist, I mean, I do create projects that are relevant to topics. You know, I mean, I do like experimental 3D animation projects, which are in one way or another relevant to some of these topics. Yeah.
Another question from the audience? Please. Can I ask, are you saying that you trademarked? Literally? I didn't know that was possible. Because I think. Specifically related to software. Interesting. Oh, very.
So just the actual question has to do with we're doing, I know there's the Fester Gates and St. Louis thing. We're also
Yes, Gates, yeah.
Strange because everything that we're doing has to do with projections. We're doing
Well, if I can respond maybe to your, to the initial question, I think, that, the use of the idea that the internet presents some kind of de facto public sphere, I think is coming out of the sort of Habermasian idea of a public sphere, which is not necessarily, it's an open question as to what we want to call public, right? Even in our city streets, we have sort of limitations, and maybe other panelists want to jump on that question. But I sort of gave it as a list of things that it is referred to because we don't have some other more public form, and yet it is one that people are privilege their kind of voice through and create through. It functions like a some other kind of open format. But that was kind of given as one version of what people think about the internet. But yeah. Cool. But I'll talk to you more later about the trademarking of that term. I'd like to know more about it. Do we have time for one more question, Meredith? Okay. And I'll say you can also tweet to us, and we'll get back to you in online space since we're out of real space time. Go ahead. Thank you. If Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think I will repeat the question. So I think the question is in reference to the statement about sort of an interface that reaches beyond walls and whether it's really open to people kind of on a level playing field. I think this comes from the idea that the internet somehow presents tools that everyone can access freely. And of course we know that's not necessarily the case. I think in terms of, I think you named a lot of, sorry that not everybody could hear her, but these limitations to that access, right? It's when we talk about a digital gap or a digital divide between people who are using these tools and aren't, that can be a factor. So there's definitely controls to access, as Angela stated. If people are paying to go into an online game, and really we're all paying for our smartphones and other things that not everybody can afford. So I think there are real world limiting factors to treating it as a level playing field, at least from where I'm sitting. If anybody else wants to respond quickly before we are.
I don't even know if mine is on. It doesn't sound on. How about this one?
Try Tim's.
Is this one on? Oh, great. I guess I wanted to say just briefly the sort of movement away when you mentioned GeoCities and that kind of like idealism around everybody having a page, everybody having space and access, and how that's kind of changed, especially with recent kind of deaths to net neutrality and the way that internet service providers can now sort of have relationships with companies that will, your ISPs can submit your personal information and downloading behavior, and you can be restricted from them because of it. And these sorts of relationships that are now acceptable because of recent legislation are certainly changing even more sort of barriers toward who has, and obviously NSA stuff, but yeah, who has access to the internet, even beyond the sort of financial aspects of it.
I hope that we'll continue this conversation in person throughout the weekend, and thank you so much for your time, your ears, and your questions, and talk to you soon.